At 4:30 in the morning on September 15, 1944, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa sat in his command bunker deep inside the coral ridges of Peleliu Island, listening. The sound he had been dreading for weeks was finally here. Through meters of rock and earth, he could hear the distant thunder of American naval guns beginning their pre-invasion bombardment. For the next 12 hours, those guns would pound his island with a fury that would have destroyed any conventional defense. But Nakagawa's defense was not conventional. He had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, constructing over 500 reinforced positions connected by 11 miles of tunnels carved into the coral. He had positioned his 24 Type 91 howitzers with mathematical precision, pre-registering their firing coordinates on every likely American approach. He had done everything his training and experience had taught him. And he knew, with a certainty that made his hands tremble as he held his pen, that it would not be enough. The notebook in front of him contained observations he had compiled over months of studying American operations at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam. He had read every captured document, interrogated every prisoner who had witnessed American artillery in action. The picture these sources painted was so far beyond Japanese capabilities that senior officers in Tokyo had dismissed his reports as exaggerations born of defeatist thinking. But Nakagawa had seen the truth in the eyes of survivors from Saipan who described artillery barrages that lasted hours, that covered entire hillsides, that arrived with such precision that Japanese officers could not communicate, could not maneuver, could only wait in their bunkers for the shells to stop falling or for one to find them. The first American shells struck Peleliu at 0600 hours. Nakagawa marked the time in his journal with the same meticulous precision he applied to everything. Within minutes, the bombardment had grown to an intensity that exceeded anything in his experience. The bunker shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Outside, coral fragments exploded into deadly shrapnel as 14-inch shells from American battleships cratered the landscape. This was the moment when Japanese soldiers across the Pacific had learned a terrible lesson. The Americans did not fight the way other armies fought. They did not conserve ammunition. They did not calculate minimal force necessary to achieve objectives. They simply brought overwhelming firepower to bear and kept firing until nothing remained. If you're finding this historical account compelling, please consider liking this video. Every like helps share these untold stories from the Second World War with more people who appreciate the human reality behind the history. To understand how Colonel Nakagawa and thousands of Japanese officers arrived at this moment of recognition, we must go back nearly 3 years earlier, to a time when the Imperial Japanese Army viewed American military capability with profound contempt. In January 1942, Japanese forces were unstoppable. They had struck Pearl Harbor, invaded the Philippines, conquered Malaya, and were driving deep into the Dutch East Indies. Their infantry tactics emphasized speed, aggression, and the warrior spirit of Bushido. Their artillery, while lighter than Western equivalents, was mobile and could support rapid infantry advances across difficult terrain. Japanese artillery doctrine in 1942 reflected decades of experience fighting in China and against the Russians. The standard divisional artillery regiment was equipped with 36 guns, typically a mix of 75mm field guns and the newer Type 91 105mm howitzers. These weapons were designed to be drawn by horses or light vehicles, allowing them to keep pace with fast-moving infantry. The Type 91 howitzer could fire a 15-kilogram shell to 11,500 yards at a maximum rate of 6 to 8 rounds per minute. This was considered adequate for the kind of warfare the Japanese had practiced. In China, they had faced opponents with limited artillery and even more limited industrial capacity to sustain prolonged bombardments. Against Russian forces in the border clashes of 1939, Japanese light artillery had supported aggressive infantry tactics that aimed to overrun enemy positions before the enemy could bring superior firepower to bear. Speed and maneuver were the keys. Artillery was important, but it served the infantry rather than the other way around. The Japanese army placed enormous emphasis on the spiritual qualities of its soldiers. Bushido taught that willpower and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Officers were trained to believe that aggressive action, even against superior numbers or firepower, would prevail through moral superiority and tactical skill. Artillery was seen as a supporting arm, never the decisive weapon. When American forces entered the war, Japanese intelligence assessments reflected these underlying assumptions. The Americans were seen as soft, undisciplined, reliant on material wealth rather than warrior spirit. American artillery, while numerous, was expected to be poorly coordinated, slowly positioned, and ineffectively employed by soldiers who lacked the discipline and training of Japanese gunners. The Battle of Guadalcanal in August 1942 began to chip away at these comfortable certainties. When Japanese forces attempted to retake Henderson Field in September, they encountered American Marine artillery that behaved in ways Japanese doctrine did not anticipate. On the night of September 13, 1942, 2,500 Japanese troops under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki launched a coordinated assault against Marine positions on what would become known as Edson's Ridge. The Marines held a narrow spine of coral and volcanic rock about 60 feet above the surrounding jungle. Japanese forces attacked in waves, expecting to overwhelm the defenders through aggressive close combat. Instead, they encountered coordinated artillery fire that transformed the jungle approaches into a killing ground. American forward observers, positioned with the infantry, called down fire from multiple batteries simultaneously. The shells arrived not in sporadic bursts but in sustained concentrations that covered entire grid squares. Japanese assault troops, trained to close with the enemy and use their superior fighting spirit, found themselves pinned under artillery fire before they could reach American positions. Wave after wave broke against Marine defenses, not because American infantry was invincible, but because Japanese troops could not survive the artillery fire long enough to engage. The Marines defending Edson's Ridge suffered fewer than 50 casualties while Japanese forces lost over 700 killed. The disparity was so extreme that it could not be explained by superior fighting spirit or tactical skill. Something fundamental about American artillery was different from anything Japanese forces had encountered. Reconnaissance patrols sent to examine the battlefield after the failed assault found evidence that troubled Japanese commanders. The volume of shell craters indicated a rate of fire far exceeding what Japanese artillery could sustain. More concerning, the accuracy of the fire suggested a level of coordination between forward observers and gun batteries that Japanese doctrine considered impossible under combat conditions. Japanese artillery officers who studied the aftermath noted something else. American shells had been fused to burst at different heights, maximizing casualties among troops in the open. This required not just abundant ammunition but a sophisticated fire control system that could adjust fuses, calculate trajectories, and coordinate multiple batteries firing simultaneously. Captain Masaru Hirakushi, an artillery officer with the 17th Army on Guadalcanal, kept a diary that was later captured by American forces. His entries from late September 1942 reveal a growing awareness that Japanese artillery was facing something unprecedented. He wrote about American fire missions that lasted hours, that covered square kilometers, that seemed to arrive whenever Japanese forces tried to concentrate for an attack. What frustrated Hirakushi most was the coordination. Japanese artillery batteries operated independently, each supporting its assigned infantry unit. Communication between batteries was poor, centralized fire control rare. The Americans, by contrast, seemed able to mass the fires of multiple batteries on a single target with minutes of notice. The result was a concentration of explosives that Japanese formations could not survive. The turning point in Japanese understanding came not at Guadalcanal, where American forces were still learning their own capabilities, but in the Central Pacific Campaign that began in November 1943. The assault on Tarawa Atoll provided Japanese defenders with their first sustained experience of what American artillery could accomplish when properly supplied and coordinated. Tarawa was a coral atoll barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide. Japanese forces under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had constructed a defense in depth with over 500 pillboxes and fortified positions. Nearly 5,000 Japanese troops defended the island, supported by artillery including several 8-inch coastal guns taken from Singapore. Shibasaki had studied American tactics at Guadalcanal and believed he understood the threat. His fortifications were designed to withstand naval bombardment. His troops were positioned to survive preliminary fires and then emerge to destroy American forces as they landed. He had pre-registered his artillery on the beaches where American troops would have to concentrate. The American assault on Tarawa began on November 20, 1943 with the heaviest pre-invasion bombardment yet attempted in the Pacific. Naval guns fired for 3 hours while carrier aircraft dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. Then the Marines landed, and Japanese defenders emerged from their bunkers to fight. What followed was 76 hours of the most intense combat of the Pacific War to that point. Japanese forces fought with desperate courage. But they could not overcome a fundamental imbalance in firepower. American artillery forward observers, moving with assault troops, called down fire from ships offshore. The ships responded with devastating accuracy, smashing Japanese strongpoints one by one. Japanese artillery batteries tried to support their infantry but found themselves targeted by counter-battery fire before they could achieve effective fire. American spotters, using both ground observation and aerial reconnaissance, pinpointed Japanese gun positions and directed naval guns against them. Japanese guns that had been carefully positioned and camouflaged were destroyed within minutes of firing their first rounds. Lieutenant Colonel Tokyo Sugai, commanding a Japanese artillery battalion on Tarawa, kept a log of American fire missions that survived in fragments. His notes record American salvos arriving every few minutes, sometimes from multiple directions, always with devastating accuracy. He noted that his own guns could fire perhaps 3 to 4 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. American ships seemed capable of sustained fire rates far exceeding this, with shell weights that dwarfed anything Japanese guns could deliver. But it was not just the volume or accuracy that shocked Japanese defenders. It was the system behind the fire. American artillery operated as an integrated whole. Forward observers identified targets. Fire direction centers calculated firing data. Multiple batteries fired simultaneously, their shells programmed to arrive at the target at the same moment in what Americans called time-on-target missions. This coordination created concentrations of fire that Japanese forces had never imagined possible. The casualties spoke for themselves. Of nearly 5,000 Japanese defenders on Tarawa, only 17 survived to be captured. The rest died, many of them in their bunkers, killed not in close combat but by the relentless bombardment that preceded every American advance. Word of what had happened at Tarawa spread through the Japanese military like a shockwave. Officers who had dismissed earlier reports as exaggeration now faced undeniable evidence. American forces possessed artillery capabilities that rendered traditional Japanese defensive tactics obsolete. The question was what to do about it. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, assigned to defend Iwo Jima in mid-1944, spent weeks studying reports from Tarawa, Saipan, and other American assaults. His conclusions were documented in letters to his wife and in official reports to Tokyo. American artillery, he wrote, was not just superior in numbers but in every aspect of employment. Japanese forces could not survive in positions exposed to American observation. They could not concentrate for counterattacks without being destroyed by massed fires. They could not even communicate effectively once American artillery opened fire. Kuribayashi's solution was to abandon conventional defense entirely. Instead of fighting on the beaches, he would position his forces in deep underground positions where artillery could not reach them. Instead of massed counterattacks, he would employ small unit tactics designed to inflict maximum casualties while avoiding exposure to American firepower. Every aspect of his defense recognized a simple truth Japanese officers had been learning since Guadalcanal. In a straight fight against American artillery, Japanese forces would lose. This recognition forced a psychological shift as profound as any in the war. Japanese officers were professional soldiers, proud of their training and tradition. The idea that enemy forces possessed such overwhelming material superiority that tactical skill and fighting spirit could not overcome it challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Documents captured from Japanese forces on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa reveal this changing awareness in stark detail. Japanese intelligence summaries from mid-1944 onward describe American artillery with something approaching awe. They note the rapidity with which American forces establish fire support coordination. They document American ability to mass fires from battalion, regimental, and even corps-level artillery on single targets. They describe American ammunition expenditure rates that exceed Japanese daily allowances in a matter of minutes. One intelligence report from the 32nd Army defending Okinawa, compiled in March 1945, includes an entire section on American artillery tactics. The report notes that American forces typically deploy 105mm howitzers at the battalion level, 155mm howitzers at division level, and heavier guns at corps level. These weapons, the report states, can fire coordinated missions that place thousands of shells on target areas measuring only a few hundred meters across. The report concludes that Japanese defensive positions, no matter how well constructed, cannot survive sustained American artillery fire. What made this assessment particularly devastating was the comparison with Japanese capabilities. Where Americans deployed divisional artillery consisting of 4 battalions with a total of 48 guns, Japanese divisions typically had 1 artillery regiment with 36 guns. American artillery batteries could sustain fire rates of 4 rounds per gun per minute for hours. Japanese batteries struggled to maintain even brief bombardments due to ammunition shortages. American forward observers operated sophisticated radio equipment that allowed near-instantaneous fire missions. Japanese forward observers often relied on telephone lines that American counter-battery fire regularly destroyed. The technological gap extended to the weapons themselves. The American M2A1 105mm howitzer could fire a 33-pound shell to 12,200 yards with remarkable accuracy. The Japanese Type 91 105mm howitzer fired a lighter 15-kilogram shell to only 10,500 meters with less accuracy due to inferior optics and fire control systems. In a duel between these weapons, the American gun had longer range, heavier shells, and faster firing rates. But even these technical comparisons understated the real disparity. American artillery doctrine emphasized massed fires coordinated at the highest possible level. Fire direction centers could coordinate entire battalions to fire time on target missions where dozens of guns fired at precise intervals calculated so that all shells arrived simultaneously. This created an effect Japanese artillery could never replicate. Instead of giving defenders time to take cover as shells arrived one by one, time on target missions caught entire units exposed in the open, maximizing casualties in the crucial first seconds of impact. The psychological impact of this firepower on Japanese defenders was profound and well documented. Soldiers who survived American artillery bombardments described an experience unlike anything in their training or previous combat experience. The ground shook continuously. The air filled with the shriek of incoming shells and the thunder of explosions. Communication became impossible. Movement above ground meant certain death. All a soldier could do was huddle in whatever cover was available and wait for the bombardment to end or for a shell to find him. A Japanese private named Yoshio Yamakawa, captured on Okinawa in May 1945, told his interrogators about an American artillery barrage that had destroyed his company. The shells, he said, had fallen for 2 hours without pause. Every attempt to move, to communicate, to coordinate a response had been met with renewed fire that killed anyone who showed themselves. By the time the barrage lifted, half his company was dead or wounded. The survivors were so shaken they could barely function as a military unit. This was the reality that Colonel Nakagawa faced on Peleliu in September 1944. He knew, from reports and from his own observations of American operations, what was coming. The question was whether his defensive preparations would allow his forces to survive long enough to exact a meaningful price from the American assault. As the pre-invasion bombardment intensified and coral fragments rained down on his command bunker, Nakagawa opened his journal and began to write. His observations would survive the battle and provide historians with one of the most detailed accounts of what Japanese officers truly thought about American artillery. What he wrote was not the propaganda his training had taught him to believe. It was not confident assertions about Japanese superiority or dismissals of American weakness. It was the measured assessment of a professional soldier who understood he was facing a form of warfare his army was not equipped to contest. And in every line, you could read the dread. The bombardment of Peleliu lasted 3 days. Battleships Tennessee and Idaho moved to within 2,500 yards of the shore, so close that Japanese defenders could see individual sailors on deck. The big guns fired methodically, systematically working through a target list that should have destroyed every defensive position on the island. By the time the guns fell silent on the morning of September 15th, naval commanders believed they had run out of targets. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf reported that all worthwhile objectives had been neutralized. He was catastrophically wrong. Colonel Nakagawa's defenses had been designed specifically to survive this kind of bombardment. His bunkers were buried under meters of coral and reinforced concrete. His gun positions were positioned on reverse slopes where naval guns could not reach them. Most importantly, he had forbidden his artillery from firing back during the bombardment, keeping their positions hidden from American spotters. When the Marines of the 1st Division landed at 8:32 a.m., they met scattered resistance from machine guns positioned near the beach. The real killing began when they advanced inland, exactly as Nakagawa had planned. Japanese artillery that had remained silent during the 3-day bombardment suddenly opened fire with devastating accuracy. The guns had been pre-registered on every likely approach route. Shells fell among Marine formations with precision that shocked American commanders who had expected the bombardment to suppress Japanese artillery. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who landed that morning with Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, later described the experience. The beach was a chaos of burning vehicles and wounded men. Artillery fire fell continuously. The noise was overwhelming, the confusion total. Marines who had fought at Cape Gloucester and other Pacific battles reported that Peleliu was different. The Japanese were not charging to their deaths in banzai attacks. They were fighting from prepared positions with coordinated artillery support, and they were exacting a terrible price. The 1st Marine Regiment, under Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, pushed north toward a series of coral ridges that would become known as Bloody Nose Ridge. The terrain was unlike anything American forces had encountered. Coral formations rose in jagged peaks riddled with caves. Japanese defenders had connected these caves with tunnels, creating a 3-dimensional battlefield where the enemy could appear, fire, and disappear without ever exposing themselves to counterfire. American artillery tried to support the advance, but the coral absorbed shells without creating useful fragments. Naval gunfire had similar problems. The terrain that American commanders had dismissed as low rolling hills in their intelligence assessments turned out to be a nightmare of vertical coral cliffs and hidden positions. Every meter had to be taken with flamethrowers, grenades, and close combat. And all the while, Japanese artillery from positions deep inside the ridges continued to fire, calling down shells on any American concentration. The battle that commanders had predicted would last 4 days stretched into weeks. By September 23, 8 days after the landing, American forces controlled the airfield and the southern portion of the island. But Bloody Nose Ridge remained in Japanese hands, and the casualties were mounting at a rate that alarmed senior officers. The 1st Marine Regiment had suffered over 60% casualties. Companies that had landed with 200 men were reduced to fewer than 70. What shocked Japanese defenders was not that Americans could be stopped. It was what happened when they were stopped. American forces did not withdraw. They did not pause to reorganize. Instead, they brought more firepower forward. Artillery batteries that had initially fired from ships offshore were landed on the island and positioned to deliver direct fire against Japanese cave positions. Marine Corsair fighters began operating from the captured airfield within days, flying close air support missions so close to friendly forces that pilots did not bother raising their landing gear between takeoff and landing. The introduction of napalm marked a turning point. This gelid gasoline weapon, used only sparingly before Peleliu, proved devastatingly effective at burning vegetation away from cave entrances and killing the occupants. Japanese soldiers who had felt secure in their underground positions found themselves facing a weapon that filled tunnels with fire and consumed the oxygen they needed to breathe. But what truly distinguished American firepower at Peleliu was the coordination. Forward observers moved with infantry units, calling down artillery fire within minutes. Naval gunfire controllers directed the fire of multiple ships against specific targets. Air liaison officers coordinated strikes by Marine Corsairs and Navy dive bombers. The entire system worked as an integrated whole, bringing overwhelming violence against any Japanese position that revealed itself. Japanese documents captured after the battle reveal the psychological impact of this firepower. Officers wrote of being unable to communicate once American artillery opened fire. They described soldiers going mad in the tunnels as shells collapsed entrances and exits. They noted that counterattacks, which Japanese doctrine emphasized, became suicide missions as American artillery destroyed any formation that gathered above ground. Colonel Nakagawa's garrison held out for 74 days. When organized resistance finally ended on November 27, 1944, fewer than 200 Japanese soldiers out of nearly 11,000 had survived to be captured. American casualties exceeded 9,800, making Peleliu the costliest battle in proportion to forces engaged in American military history. The lessons Japanese commanders took from Peleliu were clear and terrifying. Even the most sophisticated defensive preparations could not protect against American firepower when properly coordinated. Survival required going deeper underground, spreading forces more widely, and abandoning any hope of offensive action. The warrior spirit that Japanese military culture emphasized so heavily was irrelevant against an enemy who could call down hundreds of artillery shells on a single position. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi absorbed these lessons thoroughly. Assigned to defend Iwo Jima in June 1944, he had months to study reports from Peleliu and other American assaults. His conclusions shaped a defense that would extract the highest possible cost from American forces while acknowledging that victory was impossible. Kuribayashi's approach represented a radical departure from traditional Japanese tactics. Where previous commanders had positioned artillery near beaches to contest landings, Kuribayashi placed his guns inland where American naval bombardment could not reach them. Where others had planned to defend at the water's edge, he positioned his forces in depth, allowing Americans to land unopposed before engaging them. Most importantly, he forbade the banzai charges that had characterized Japanese defensive tactics earlier in the war. The reasoning behind these decisions appeared in letters Kuribayashi wrote to his wife and in orders he issued to his commanders. American firepower, he explained, made any exposed position untenable. The pre-landing bombardments that preceded American assaults would destroy anything on or near the beaches. The solution was to build defenses that could not be destroyed from outside. Deep underground positions connected by tunnels, with multiple entrances and exits, stocked with ammunition and supplies to sustain prolonged resistance. By the time American forces invaded Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, Kuribayashi had constructed over 18 kilometers of tunnels connecting hundreds of fortified positions. The island was honeycombed with bunkers positioned to provide mutual support. Artillery pieces, including 361 guns of 75mm or larger caliber, were emplaced in caves with clear fields of fire but protected from air and naval bombardment. Kuribayashi's orders to his troops reflected his understanding of American capabilities. Every soldier was to kill 10 Americans before dying. No one was to waste their life in futile charges. Positions were to be held until they became untenable, then abandoned through tunnels to other prepared positions. The goal was not victory, which Kuribayashi knew was impossible, but maximum American casualties over maximum time. The American assault began with the heaviest preliminary bombardment yet attempted in the Pacific. For 74 days before the invasion, bombers had struck Iwo Jima continuously. In the 3 days immediately preceding the landing, battleships and cruisers fired thousands of shells at Japanese positions. American commanders believed this bombardment had destroyed most Japanese defenses. They were wrong in exactly the way Kuribayashi had anticipated. When Marines landed on the morning of February 19th, they encountered minimal resistance on the beaches. The black volcanic sand made movement difficult, vehicles bogged down, but Japanese fire was sporadic. Then, exactly as Kuribayashi had planned, when the beaches were crowded with men and equipment, Japanese artillery opened fire from positions that had survived the bombardment intact. The effect was devastating. Pre-registered artillery fire fell among landing craft still approaching the shore. Mortars, including massive 320mm spigot mortars, dropped shells that created craters large enough to swallow entire squads. Marines who had landed found themselves pinned on beaches where the volcanic sand made digging impossible and every movement drew fire. 519 Marines were killed on that first day. Nearly 500 more would die of wounds in the days that followed. 30,000 men made it ashore, but at a cost that stunned even veteran commanders who had seen the worst of Pacific fighting. What followed was 36 days of the most intense combat of the Pacific War. American forces had to take Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano on the island's southern tip, then push north through a landscape of ridges and ravines that the Japanese had turned into a fortress. Every position had to be destroyed individually. Flamethrowers, demolitions, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support were all required to eliminate positions that had been designed to withstand exactly these weapons. American artillery at Iwo Jima operated on a scale that would have been unimaginable earlier in the war. Joint assault signal companies coordinated fire from Marine artillery battalions, Army artillery batteries, and naval guns offshore. The sophistication of this coordination impressed even Japanese commanders. Late in the battle, Kuribayashi himself dictated from his underground bunker a comment that revealed how completely Japanese officers had come to respect American firepower. He was not afraid, he said, of fighting 3 Marine divisions. It was the bombardment from aircraft and warships that created the miserable situation Japanese forces faced. If you've been engaged by this deep dive into the Pacific War's artillery battles, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these detailed historical accounts to viewers who appreciate accuracy and depth in their World War II content. The numbers from Iwo Jima tell the story of American firepower perhaps better than any description. American forces fired over 1 million rounds of artillery ammunition during the battle. Naval guns added 600,000 rounds. Aircraft dropped thousands of tons of bombs and napalm. The 8-square-mile island was transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Yet despite this overwhelming firepower, nearly 7,000 Americans died taking Iwo Jima. Another 25,000 were wounded. The Japanese garrison of 21,000 men fought almost to the last. Only 216 were captured alive. The battle that American commanders had expected to last days stretched into 5 weeks of grinding attrition. Japanese veterans who survived described an experience beyond anything in their previous combat. The ground shook continuously from explosions. Communication became impossible. Units were isolated from their commanders, fighting independently without coordination or hope of relief. Soldiers who emerged from caves to counterattack were destroyed before they could close with American positions. Those who remained underground faced death from flamethrowers that filled tunnels with fire or demolitions that collapsed entrances. But the true test of Japanese understanding of American artillery came not at Iwo Jima but at Okinawa. This island, just 340 miles from the Japanese home islands, was to serve as the staging base for the planned invasion of Japan itself. The defense was entrusted to the 32nd Army under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, who commanded over 100,000 troops, the largest Japanese garrison yet assembled to defend a Pacific island. Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Izumu Cho, had studied every previous American assault. They had access to detailed reports from Peleliu and Iwo Jima. They understood exactly what American artillery could accomplish when properly employed. Their defensive plan reflected this knowledge completely. Like Kuribayashi, Ushijima chose not to defend the beaches. American forces would be allowed to land unopposed. The 32nd Army would fight from prepared positions in southern Okinawa, using the island's rugged terrain to maximum advantage. Artillery would be concealed in caves and fired sparingly to avoid drawing counter-battery fire. The goal was not to prevent American victory, but to make it so costly that the United States would reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, with the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Over 182,000 American troops landed against minimal opposition. The contrast with previous invasions was stark. Marines and Army infantry moved inland expecting heavy resistance and found almost none. By nightfall, thousands of troops were ashore and pushing across the island. The illusion of easy victory lasted exactly 4 days. On April 4, American forces advancing south encountered the first of 3 major Japanese defensive lines stretching across the island. What followed would be 82 days of the most savage fighting of the Pacific War. American artillery at Okinawa operated on a scale that exceeded anything previously seen. The 10th Army deployed over 380 guns in direct support of ground forces. These were augmented by naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers offshore. On April 19, American forces opened their assault on Japanese positions with a barrage from 324 guns, the largest artillery bombardment in the Pacific theater. The numbers are staggering. During the Okinawa campaign, American forces fired over 1.1 million rounds of 105mm ammunition alone. When naval gunfire is included, over 600,000 additional rounds slammed into Japanese positions. The XXIV Corps dropped 521,000 mortar rounds, fired 9 million rifle bullets, expended 16 million machine gun rounds, and threw 367,000 hand grenades. The result was a landscape of utter devastation. The southern half of Okinawa was transformed into a cratered wasteland where nothing lived and nothing stood. Villages were obliterated. Hills were flattened. The countryside became an alien landscape of shell holes and burned earth. Yet Japanese forces held. Positioned in caves connected by tunnels, they waited out American bombardments and emerged to fight when the shelling stopped. Artillery duels raged day and night, with Japanese guns firing from concealed positions and American artillery attempting to silence them. The casualties mounted on both sides, but the Japanese defensive lines held week after week. What finally broke the Japanese defense was not firepower alone, but the systematic integration of all American combat arms. Artillery suppressed Japanese positions. Infantry advanced under this covering fire. Tanks and flamethrowers eliminated strongpoints. Engineers demolished caves and sealed tunnel entrances. Naval gunfire destroyed anything beyond the range of field artillery. Aircraft provided close air support and interdicted Japanese supply lines. This coordination was sophisticated beyond anything Japanese forces had encountered. American forward observers moved with the lead infantry, calling down artillery fire within minutes of identifying targets. Time-on-target missions brought shells from multiple batteries simultaneously, giving defenders no warning to take cover. Naval gunfire controllers aboard ships offshore directed fire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers with precision that shocked Japanese artillery officers who had never seen such coordination. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was profound and well documented. Captured diaries and post-war interviews reveal soldiers describing an experience that broke even the most determined. The bombardments were so intense that communication became impossible. Officers could not coordinate their units. Soldiers were isolated in their positions, fighting alone, waiting for the shells to find them or for American infantry to arrive with flamethrowers. One Japanese officer captured on Okinawa told his interrogators that American firepower was the only thing that defeated Japanese forces. Without the artillery and naval bombardment, he said, American troops could never have advanced. The comment echoed Kurobayashi's observation from Iwo Jima and reflected a truth that every Japanese officer who faced American forces had learned. Material superiority on the scale Americans could deploy made tactical skill and fighting spirit irrelevant. By June 22, 1945, when the battle ended, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. American casualties exceeded 49,000, including over 12,000 killed. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, the 10th Army commander, killed by Japanese artillery fire just days before the island was declared secure. The human cost was almost incomprehensible. Between 1/10 and 1/4 of Okinawa's civilian population perished. At least 142,000 Okinawan civilians died, many killed by artillery fire from both sides, others forced by Japanese soldiers to commit suicide rather than surrender to American forces. The battle's violence left permanent marks on everyone who experienced it. American soldiers who had fought across North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany reported that nothing in the European theater compared to Okinawa's intensity. Marines who had survived Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima said Okinawa was worse. The constant artillery fire, the close combat in caves and tunnels, the knowledge that the enemy would fight literally to the last man created a psychological strain that broke thousands of combat veterans. For Japanese officers, Okinawa represented the final confirmation of what they had been learning since Guadalcanal. American artillery, employed with the coordination and abundance that characterized American operations, created conditions under which effective defense was impossible. You could inflict casualties. You could delay the inevitable. But you could not win. Documents captured from the 32nd Army headquarters reveal how completely this understanding had permeated Japanese military thinking by 1945. Intelligence summaries describe American artillery tactics in detail, noting the rapid response times, the coordination between ground and air forces, the seemingly unlimited ammunition expenditure. Staff officers calculated that Japanese defensive positions, regardless of how well constructed, could not survive sustained American bombardment. The conclusion drawn from these analyses was stark. Continued resistance would only increase casualties without changing the outcome. This recognition influenced Japanese decision-making at the highest levels. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one factor in his decision was the devastating losses at Okinawa. The battle had demonstrated that defending the home islands would result in casualties on a scale that threatened the nation's survival. The irony was profound. Japanese military culture had emphasized spiritual power over material strength. Bushido taught that willpower and determination could overcome superior numbers or equipment. The entire edifice of Japanese military training rested on the assumption that highly motivated warriors would prevail against materially superior but spiritually inferior enemies. American artillery shattered this assumption completely. It did not matter how brave Japanese soldiers were if they died in their bunkers without ever seeing the enemy. It did not matter how determined Japanese officers were if they could not communicate with their units or coordinate their defenses. It did not matter how sophisticated Japanese tactics were if American forces could simply call down thousands of artillery shells on any position they encountered. The transformation in Japanese military thinking was total. Officers who in 1942 had dismissed American forces as soft and undisciplined, who had expected quick victories based on superior fighting spirit, had learned through bitter experience that modern warfare favored the side that could bring more guns, more shells, more coordination to the battlefield. And America possessed these advantages in quantities Japan could never match. This lesson extended beyond artillery to the broader question of industrial warfare. American forces did not just have more guns. They had more of everything. More tanks, more aircraft, more ships, more ammunition, more fuel, more food. The logistics system that supplied American forces operated on a scale that Japanese officers found almost impossible to comprehend. When Japanese soldiers captured American supply dumps, they were astonished by the abundance. Food rations that included chocolate and cigarettes. Medical supplies in quantities that exceeded what entire Japanese divisions received. Spare parts for every vehicle and weapon. Fuel stocks that seemed unlimited. The comparison with Japanese deprivation was demoralizing. More importantly, American forces never seemed to run out. Artillery batteries that fired thousands of shells in a single day would have full ammunition stocks the next day. Units that suffered heavy casualties received replacements within days. Equipment damaged in combat was repaired or replaced immediately. The machine never stopped, never slowed, never ran out of resources. Japanese veterans interviewed after the war consistently emphasized this aspect of American power. It was not just that American soldiers were well trained or that American equipment was good. It was that the entire system, from factories in Detroit to artillery positions on Okinawa, functioned with an efficiency and abundance that Japan could not match. You were not fighting an army. You were fighting an industrial colossus that could absorb any losses and continue advancing. Thank you for watching this exploration of a crucial but often overlooked aspect of the Pacific War. If you found value in this detailed historical analysis, please consider subscribing to the channel. We create in-depth content about World War II that goes beyond the surface level, examining the human experiences and material realities that shaped the conflict. Your support through likes, subscriptions, and shares helps us continue producing historically accurate content that honors the memory of those who fought. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and what other aspects of the Pacific War you'd like us to explore in future videos. The story of Japanese officers writing about American artillery with dread is ultimately a story about perception colliding with reality. It is a story about professional soldiers, trained to believe in the superiority of spirit over material, forced to acknowledge that modern industrial warfare operated by different rules. It is a story about how an entire military culture had to abandon cherished beliefs because the evidence against those beliefs was overwhelming and undeniable. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, Japanese officers documented their growing awareness of American artillery superiority in captured diaries, official reports, and post-war interviews. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Initial dismissiveness gave way to concern, concern to alarm, alarm to something approaching despair. By 1945, Japanese military planning documents treated American artillery not as a challenge to be overcome but as an unavoidable reality to be endured. This recognition did not come from a single battle or a single revelation. It emerged from the accumulated experience of thousands of Japanese officers who faced American firepower and survived to report what they had seen. It came from studying the wreckage of positions that had been designed to withstand bombardment but had been destroyed anyway. It came from interrogating survivors who described artillery concentrations beyond anything Japanese forces could deliver. Most powerfully, it came from the simple mathematics of survival. Japanese units defending against American assaults could calculate their life expectancy based on how long they could survive concentrated artillery fire. Officers planning defensive operations had to factor in the reality that any concentration of troops would draw American artillery within minutes. Soldiers in the field learned that revealing their position meant death from artillery shells they could not see coming and could not escape. The dread that Japanese officers felt, that appears so clearly in their written reports, was not cowardice or defeatism. It was the rational response of professional soldiers confronting a form of warfare their training had not prepared them for and their industrial base could not match. It was the recognition that fighting spirit, tactical skill, and determined resistance could not overcome an enemy who possessed artillery superiority on the scale Americans deployed. This understanding shaped Japanese strategy in the war's final year. The decision to fight defensive battles of attrition, to abandon offensive operations, to position forces underground where artillery could not reach them all reflected this hard-won knowledge. Japanese commanders knew they could not win. The goal became extracting the maximum cost for American victory in hopes that casualty lists would influence American public opinion or strategic calculations. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before this strategy could be tested in the defense of the Japanese home islands. But the plans that Japanese officers had prepared for that defense reflected everything they had learned about American artillery. Troops would be positioned deep underground. Coastal defenses would be minimal, with the real fighting to occur inland. No large-scale counterattacks would be attempted. Every soldier would fight from prepared positions until killed or until ammunition ran out. These plans acknowledged implicitly what Japanese officers had learned explicitly. Against American artillery employed with American coordination and American abundance, conventional defense was futile. The only option was to make the cost high enough that the enemy might reconsider. It was the strategy of desperation employed by an army that had run out of options. The historical record is clear on this point. From Peleliu to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, Japanese defensive plans became progressively more sophisticated in response to American artillery. Positions went deeper underground. Defensive zones became more dispersed. Offensive operations were abandoned entirely. Every evolution reflected lessons learned from previous battles about what American firepower could accomplish. But sophistication could not overcome material disparity. The fundamental problem Japanese forces faced was not tactical but industrial. American factories could produce more guns, more shells, more vehicles than Japanese factories. American logistics could deliver these supplies to the front faster than Japanese logistics. American training could integrate new soldiers into functioning units more rapidly than Japanese training. The entire system operated at a scale and efficiency that Japan could not match. This reality shaped every aspect of the Pacific War's final year. Japanese soldiers knew they were fighting a losing battle. Officers knew that even brilliant tactics could not overcome American material superiority. Commanders knew that every defensive position would eventually fall regardless of how well prepared. The war continued not because anyone believed Japan could win, but because military culture and political imperatives demanded continued resistance. When the war finally ended, the relief among Japanese officers was palpable. Post-war interviews reveal men who had spent years expecting death, who had watched their commands destroyed by artillery fire they could not counter, who had issued orders they knew were futile because orders had to be issued. The surrender, whatever dishonor it carried in Japanese military culture, meant survival. It meant no more watching soldiers die under bombardments they could not escape. It meant the end of fighting an enemy whose artillery made tactical skill irrelevant. The legacy of this experience shaped Japanese military thinking for generations. Post-war Japanese defense forces emphasized technological parity as a prerequisite for effective defense. The lessons about industrial capacity and logistics that Japanese officers had learned so painfully influenced strategic planning. The recognition that modern warfare favored the side with superior material resources became foundational to Japanese military doctrine. For American forces, the artillery tactics developed and refined in the Pacific became the foundation for future operations. The coordination between forward observers and fire direction centers that proved so effective against Japanese positions became standard practice. The integration of artillery, naval gunfire, and air support that characterized operations from Peleliu to Okinawa influenced American military doctrine through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. But the human cost of these lessons should not be forgotten. The artillery barrages that Japanese officers wrote about with such dread killed not just soldiers but civilians caught in the fighting. The ammunition expenditure that demonstrated American industrial capacity also created landscapes of devastation that took decades to recover. The coordination that made American artillery so effective also made battles more destructive and casualties more numerous on both sides. The story of Japanese officers and American artillery is finally a story about how war really works. It is not decided by the courage of individual soldiers or the brilliance of commanders, though both matter. It is decided by industrial capacity, logistics, and the ability to deliver firepower where and when it is needed. The side that can bring more guns, more shells, and better coordination to the battlefield will win regardless of the enemy's determination or tactical skill. Japanese officers learned this lesson through the most brutal teacher imaginable: direct experience of American artillery fire. They documented their learning in reports that survive as testimony to how completely their understanding changed. From dismissive contempt in 1942 to respectful fear in 1945, the transformation was total and irreversible. Their dread was justified. Their reports were accurate. And the lessons they learned about industrial warfare remain relevant today. Material superiority matters. Logistics matter. Coordination matters. And against an enemy who possesses all three in abundance, even the most determined defense will eventually fail. This is what Japanese officers discovered, what they wrote about with growing dread, and what they could not overcome no matter how hard they fought or how well they prepared. It is a truth written in the rubble of Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, purchased with the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, and documented in the words of officers who understood they were facing something their military culture had not prepared them to defeat.